All right, I will say good evening. Sorry about the change in schedule for this week, but let's continue. So the first thing we're doing is we're finishing up the Mar Makomos from last week's shir. I believe Choresh part 2. We left off on source number 13. So that's from last week. I just reposted that source sheet in the chat, so you could see that in the WhatsApp group. Again, so source number 13. So I'll say, so remember again, let's actually go back for a moment just to source number 12. Again from last week. So Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. Now I will say we are finishing up tonight in Meretz Hashem, the Malacha of Choresh. So the Shulchan Aruch writes as follows. He says, Tit sha'al raglo o al minalav. If a person has mud on his shoe or on his foot, so what's the halacha? Mekancho b'kosav alo b'karka. You can wipe your foot off or your shoe off on the wall, but not on the ground. Dilma asila shvuye gumo. So the first opinion in the Shulchan Aruch says, again, I will say it's a very common case. A person has mud on their shoe. I want to wipe the mud off my shoe. So again, I want to scrape the mud off. So what do you scrape the mud off on? So the Shulchan Aruch says you could scrape the mud off against the structure, against the building, against the wall, but you can't scrape your shoe against the ground. Why not? What are we concerned about? We're concerned that in the act of scraping your foot against the ground, you're going to come to go ahead and level out the ground. And of course, again, leveling out the ground, remember again, in the inside of the house is boneh. Outside of the house is going to be choresh. So we'll say that's the first opinion in the Shulchan Aruch. Some say that you're not even allowed to scrape your foot against the wall, scrape your shoe against the wall. And some say that both are permitted, both against the wall as well as against or on the ground. Fine, so let's analyze this. So we left off, so that's the source we left off with in last week's shir. Let's continue now in number 13. So we'll say, so again, essentially, two different opinions, right? Actually, the truth is really three opinions. Opinion number one is you can scrape your feet against the wall, but not against the ground, okay? Opinion number two, ultimately you can't even scrape your foot against the wall. And opinion number three, you can scrape your foot against both. So what's going on over here? Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah number 13. Mishnah Berurah says, Af bekosel shalavanu mishum demechse kimosef alabin. I will say, now, reason number one, or I should say approach number one, is intuitive, as the Shulchan Aruch spells it out. Well, what was the logic there? The logic in approach number one is, when you go out and you scrape your foot against the wall, or I should say against the ground, there's a general concern of ashvuye gumos, of leveling out the ground. That same concern, of course, doesn't apply when scraping your foot against the wall. That's the logic of the first opinion. What's the logic of the second opinion that says that you can't scrape it against the wall? So here the Mishnah Berurah says in number 13, Shalavan mishum demechse kimosef ala binyan umechazko. So the idea over here is scraping your foot against the wall has the appearance of what? Of boneh. Of boneh. In other words, the act of putting mud against the wall would have the appearance ultimately of strengthening the wall. So that's the logic of the second opinion. So second opinion would say you can't scrape your feet against the ground, lest you come to level out the ground. You can't scrape your feet against the wall because it looks like you're strengthening the structure. Okay, what about the third opinion that says that it's mutter to do both, to scrape it against the wall and scrape it against the ground? So that's source number 14. That's Mishnah Berurah. He says, B'shnehem, T'lemosef ala binyan lo chayshinon, mishum de binyan chakulo'ohu, binyan gorosh abalek farim, or the Shema Yikaneach Mimakom Aguma V'Yeshavena Gamkin Lo Chayshinan. So the third opinion says like this. I'm not worried about you scraping it against the wall. Why? No one's going to think that's building. No one builds like that. So that's not building. Furthermore, again, the third opinion says, we're not concerned, even if you scrape your foot against the ground, we're not concerned that you're going to just automatically come to smooth out the ground. So the third opinion essentially says, there's nothing to worry about. There's no binyan, right? There's no building, because nobody builds like that, scraping mud against the wall. And I'm not worried about hashvas, gumos, about leveling out the ground, because again, you'll be careful. Now look what he writes. He says, Umikal makom, afilu ledido tzarech lizar, kimishanech bekarka, shaloi kanech b'makom guma sha'ayidei zeh yishavena. Now Mishnah Berurah does say, that's fine, but if you are scraping the mud off your shoes by scraping your foot against the ground, make sure to do it in an area where there is not a depression in the ground. Because obviously, again, if you do that, you're going to end up leveling it, and it's going to be problematic. Look how he ends. Ulein halacha. Shabbos says, now, what do we do with this? One of these interesting halachas in Shulchan Aruch. Three different opinions. Again, opinion number one, I will say this happens. In our Yarchei Kala, one of the funny, I don't know what the right word was, funniest or just entertaining, is we went to, what was the place we went to? Arugod Farm, right? And we got out, and literally the whole place was mud. The whole place was mud. So the contrast between Americans and, hardened Israelis was very, right? Our greatest issue was, how do we get the mud off our shoes, right? Meanwhile, again, these guys are surrounded by hostile neighbors on every single, and we're thinking, I just bought these shoes. All right. Anyway, so this is, however, a very lamaisa case. So what do you do in a situation like this where you literally have three different opinions? Again, opinion number one, can scrape it against the wall, not against the ground. Opinion number two, can't scrape it on either. Opinion number three, can scrape it on both. So what do we do? So here the Mishnah Berurah says, number 14, source number 14, 3 lines up from the bottom. Ule'inyan halacha. So halacha l'maisa, what do we do? He says, Ule'inyan halacha, taz kasov, debemidi dirabanan yesh lismoch ala makilin, demuter b'shneihen. So the Taz says, look, what are we dealing with over here? This is all dinei dirabanan. All dinei dirabanan, right? So because it's all dinei dirabanan, the Taz says, there's no problem with relying on a lenient opinion. So therefore the Taz seems to side with approach number 3, that halacha l'maisa, you could scrape your shoes both on the ground as well as on the wall. However, the yesh min achordim shesovrim the nachon lahachmir le'esar b'shneihem. That's interesting. So then the Mishnah Berurah says, but there are those who say you really should be machmir and not scrape your feet either against the wall or against the ground. All right, so now the Mishnah Berurah says, okay, shkoyach. So what do I do with this now? He says, v'nira de bekosal vada yish lismoch lahatir gedas hamachaber shekein das rov harishon. So we'll say, so the Mishnah Berurah really seems to say like this. Mishnah Berurah really seems to say like me'ikar adin, you should be mekel. Me'ikar adin, I will say, which makes sense also because that's the psak of the Ramah. Right, the Ramah himself quotes the Rush, and the Ramah himself says there's no problem. You could scrape your feet, you could scrape your shoes against the ground, or against, of course, in the ground. Just be careful not to level anything out, and against the wall. The Mishnah Berurah himself seems to end, and that's the way the Taz understands as well. But the Mishnah Berurah himself seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, don't do it against the ground, but you can do it against a wall. So we'll say this is a very lamaisa case. Right? I'm walking on Shabbos, I get mud on my shoes. It's natural, I want to scrape off the mud. So again, it would seem to me that the Mishnah Berurah's preference would be scrape it against the wall. Do not scrape it. Do not scrape it on the ground. But again, it is important to nevertheless note, and we'll actually take a look at number 15. So the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch number 15 says as follows. Again, this is last week's source packet still. He says, Tidsha al raglo o mina alav yochol la'asira b'davar shemut l'taltalo o yishikanchu b'kora aval lo yikanchu lo b'kosel v'lo b'karka. So this is interesting. The Kitzer himself is machmir. And the Kitzer himself says, you know what, ideally, best not to go ahead and scrape off your shoes, neither on the ground nor on the wall. Ubeshas adchak. He says, what about if it is extenuating circumstance? Kigon shetzoa al raglo o al mina olav ve'in davar shemut l'tatalo yachal lekanech bekosel v'im kosel lekanech bekarka. So this is interesting. He says, let's say, however, again, a person steps in excrement or something else where there's a little of a greater urgency to remove it from your shoe. So in that case, interestingly enough, the Kitzer says, ideally, still best not to go, going in order, best then to go ahead and scrape it on a structure, on a wall, but not the ground. But if there's no wall to scrape it on, you can scrape it on the ground as well. So it's interesting. So again, the Kitzer, at the bottom line, I will say, all roads kind of lead to the same place, which is this is a din d'Rabbanan, and therefore, again, there is a right to be mekel on it. The question is, when can you be mekel and how can you be mekel? So, ideally, the Kitzer says, best not to use the wall or the ground. Mishnah Berurah himself seems to indicate, ends off by saying, you could use the wall, don't use the ground, but yet bidi eved, if a person has mud or other stuff on their shoe, and they just have to go ahead and get rid of it, and your own right, and all your only options are the wall and the ground. So ideally, order is better to use the wall. But if you can't use the wall, you could use the ground. But of course, when using the ground, the caveat is, make sure not to do it in a way which is going to level anything out. So yeah, you do have to be cognizant of that. Try not to level out the ground. Okay, beautiful.
Does pavement have a din of fossil or ground? Is it din of ground only like on dirt and grass where...
So it would seem to you that for this halacha, pavement would have a different din, right? Pavement in general when we've seen it, pavement generally has a din of karka, of ground. That's usually how it's looked at. We saw this before, and even with sweeping or things like that. But it would seem to be in a halacha like this, where there's so many inherent kulas. To begin with, even scraping it directly on ground, you definitely can scrape it on pavement as well. Take a look at number 16. So the Ber Halacha writes as follows. He says over here, so we'll say here, kind of just transitioning to a different case. The Ber Halacha indicates over here that let's say a person is walking with a cane. And let's say the cane has a little bit more of like a pointed bottom on it. So therefore what happens? Every single time a person puts the cane down, there's a hole that's made in the ground. So that seems to be choresh. He says, V'myesh misamer. Misamer literally means a nail. But it doesn't have to be a nail. It could be just anything that's pointy. He says, Sha'ose guma b'halichasa, b'avi psik reisha delo nechale, sarich iyun imutor leilech bo. And he goes over here, Yayin Shabbat Mishpat Zozav, Shemitzadi Laheter Bazeh. So the Ber Halacha says that interestingly enough, Me'ikar Adin, if a person is walking with a cane, and the way the cane is that the cane is making a depression, not a depression is the wrong word, it's making a hole in the ground. So the Ber Halacha says, okay, it may be ideal to get a different kind of cane. As well, so going back to last week's shir, what kind of cane should you get? What kind of cane? Something that doesn't as much make a hole, rather it does what? Makes a depression, right? It compresses the earth. That would certainly be ideal. But if again, let's say, that I have the cane that I have is the cane that I have. So what do I do in that circumstance? So we go back to the Pri Megadim in number 17. So here, last week according to Ber Halacha, but if you look at the Pri Megadim in number 17, here's where all of this comes from. He says, Have psikresha delo nechale b'dirabanan mishum she'ino tzarich l'guma. If you remember again, this was the concept. We saw this in last week's shir, in source number 6 in the Shar Tzion, where we had this concept ultimately again of a trade d'Rabbanan, the psik reisha de lo nechale, which is an interesting concept. So you have a psik reisha de lo nechale, which means something that will definitively happen, but you don't want it to happen, right? I don't have any interest. So again, I'm walking with the cane. So now when I put down the cane is definitely going to make a hole in the ground, but I don't want the hole in the ground. So that's a psik reisha de lo nechale, and plus it's a double d'Rabbanan. What's the double d'Rabbanan? Number one, the hole is being made with a shinui in an abnormal way. And number two, it's destructive in nature. It's makalkal. So we saw this is the idea of the Pri Megadim that when you have a psikresha de lo nechale with a trade d'Rabbanan, one could be meko. So Yankee Stammen raised a very good point after last week's shir, that the shir is based on that logic that we seem to obviate almost all of the problems that we've brought up over the course of this malacha. And that's true. That is technically true, except again, we only use this Pri Megadim when we have to. Right? So in other words, this Pri Megadim would not be a heter for soccer, right? It wouldn't be so in other words, if we don't have to use it, we don't have to use it. But in certain what we call like activities of daily living, so if you need to use the Pri Megadim, you can. So just other examples of this. Therefore, this is why if a person uses a cane, they're permitted to walk with a cane, even on wet soil, where let's say the person knows for sure that the cane is going to go ahead and make a hole. Why? Psikresha de lo nechale with a trade d'Rabbanan, right? Other examples. We'll say this actually comes up, or for that matter, again, for a woman with high heels, right? Could a woman wear high heels in a place where she knows the heel is going to sink into the dirt, creating a hole? And the answer is yes. Psikresha de lo nechale with a trade d'Rabbanan. Again, remember, it's even though it's going to happen, I don't want it to happen. And number two, the hole that is created is destructive in nature and also created in an abnormal fashion. You put all of that together, and because it's a normative act of walking, we see it's permitted. Other examples of this, we'll say, let's say a person is sitting outside on Shabbos, and I'm sitting in a chair, and I know that when I sit in this chair, it's going to sink into the ground. Right? That's a little hyperbolic, not sinking to the ground, but you understand, like the legs are going to go into the ground. So am I allowed to do that? The answer is yes. Now again, could one make the argument that if you have a different chair that doesn't do that? Yeah. But again, I want to sit outside in my backyard. The ground is wet. I'm allowed to sit in that chair, but it's going to create the furrow. Again, Psikresha Delonechale with a tray D'Rabbanan. Also, sometimes by the chairs, sometimes it's also not as much of an issue. Why? Because depending on the legs of the chairs, sometimes it more compresses the dirt than goes in and makes the hole, but technically would be permitted. All right, I will say, Mazel Tov, we finished the first malacha of the 39 malachos. Incredible, at this rate, we will be done in no time. In no time, Yirtzeh Hashem. So Mazel Tov, I'm finishing Choresh. This is probably one of our easier malachas that Yirtzeh Hashem we're going to do. And I will say, we come tonight in Yirtzeh Hashem to begin the malacha of Zoreya. Zoreya literally means sowing or seeding. So let's take a look. Source number 1. Same Mishnah that we opened up the previous malacha with. The Mishnah says, Mishnah, Avos malachos arba'im chasr achos. So there are 39 malachos, 40 minus 1. The first one listed in the Mishnah was Zoreya. Just remember again, when we started Choresh, so we discussed the idea that really it makes sense that Choresh should come before Zoreya. Okay, so in any event, the Mishnah lists Zoreya first. Zoreya, so literally translated, sowing. So we'll say, just to get our terms down, what does it mean to sow? Right? It means the act of putting seeds into the ground. Okay, so what is the malacha of Zoreya? Take a look at Rashi. First of all, where was Zoreya found in the Mishkan? Right? So remember, all malachos of Shabbos come from the Mishkan. So where was Zoreya found in the Mishkan? What would you say? Right, so same thing that we saw by Choresh. Rashi says over here, number 2, about kulu kamaisehu b'samemonim shal tseva tcheles ve'agaman v'tolah shani. So Rashi, there are actually 2 ideas. Possibility 1 is for the dyes. Remember again, dyes come from herbs and different plants. The plants need to be planted, obviously, so there was Zoreya. Remember again, also for the lechem apanim. For lechem apanim, remember for the bread that is placed upon the shulchan, in order to go ahead and make bread, you need flour. Flour comes from wheat. You have to plant wheat. Okay, so what's our definition? So the Gemara Maseches Moed Katan number 3 says the definition of Zoreya is as follows: Ma darko shel Zoreya litzamuche peira. So this is actually interesting. What is Zoreya? Zoreya ultimately is litzamuche peira, to cause something to grow. Okay? Rabbeinu Chananel in number 4 says, Kal davar shuhu mashbiach hapri chayiv mishum Zoreya. So let's just literally translate it. Anything that enhances the fruit or the produce, ultimately is chayiv mishum Zoreya. So we'll say, so this gives us these 2 sources. Number 3, Gemara Maseches Moed Katan and Rabbeinu Chananel give us a working definition. The definition of Zoreya is any act which causes, facilitates, or improves the growth of a plant. That's Zoreya. Any act which causes, facilitates, or improves growth of a plant, of vegetation, that is going to be the malacha of Zoreya. Good. Well, obviously, we'll give real life. Obviously, we'll give real life examples of this. What's the shear of Zoreya? Remember again, we'll say. So, what's interesting about these malachas of Choresh and Zoreya? Every malacha has a shear, right? In other words, for example, right, for hotzah, what's the shear of hotzah for carrying on Shabbos? Talar amas in Rosh Hashanah, right? If you carry 2 amas, you carry 3 amas, so halacha l'maisa, again, you're not chayiv, at least you're not chayiv d'oraisa. So what is the shear for Zoreya? So the Rambam writes as follows, number 5, he says, Zoreya, kol shu chayiv, it's any amount. So I was supposed to say, a person could take 1 little seed and drop that into soil, and that's Zoreya. Or a person could pour a little bit of water onto a seed, onto the ground. That's Zoreya. A person, anything ultimately, again, which causes, facilitates, or improves growth in any amount, even in the most minute amount, will ultimately be Zoreya. Now, I will say, now we come to a fascinating, a little bit of lumdus, but you're going to see, yes.
There's no shear.
There is a shear. The shear is any amount. That's the shear. A kol shu. Correct. It's any amount is the shear. In a halacha, there's always a shear. Just for certain. By the way, same thing by Choresh also, right? There's by Choresh, you can make a hole of the tiniest size. That's called charisha, which makes sense because remember again by Shabbos, I will say by Shabbos the whole yisod is in the melachas machshav, is in a constructive act. So one could perform a constructive act of Zoreya by putting the smallest seed into the earth, by making the tiniest hole in the earth for Choresh. So now we come to a really interesting machlokes over here between the Minchas Chinuch and the Sefer Tal Oros. So again, remember, whenever we look at malachas, here's what we look at. We look at what is the malacha, Where was it done in the Mishkan? What is the definition of the malacha? What is the shear of the malacha? And then ultimately, again, kind of the corollary of what is the shear is, at what point are you chayiv for transgressing the malacha? Now, often, those two questions of what is the shear and when are you chayiv for transgressing are often the same question, answered the same way. But something fascinating happens over here by Zoreya. Look at number 6. So the Minchas Chinuch writes as follows. He says, Ukvar beiranu l'kamon, Dal hazriya shezara chayiv af below hishrish v'niklat klal. So I will say, listen to this. Here's what I know, right? The act of Zoreya, literal Zoreya, is sowing. Now I will say, one thing we know with absolute certainty. When you put a seed into the ground, what happens? The moment you put the seed into the ground, what happens? Nothing. The halacha understands that germination of the seed really only takes place after 72 hours. Three days. Okay, whether it's 72 hours, 48 hours, 84, whatever it is. But what I do know is, when you place that seed into the ground, absolutely nothing is happening in that moment. So Minchas is something amazing. He says, Da'al Zriya, first line, number 6. Da'al Zriya, Shezara, Chayiv, Af Belo Hishrish V'niklat Klal. So I'll say, the halacha by Zriya, the unique, interesting part about Zriya is, once you put that seed into the ground, and again, I'm just using putting seed into a ground as an example, but that's not the only example of Zriya, you have transgressed the malacha. Even though what? The seed has not taken root, right, and has not done anything. He says, furthermore, even though, Kigon Shnis Kalkel Tekif Al Yidei Ezes Siba, O Shetekif Higbia Min HaKarka Chayev Amaisa Zriya. Listen to this, I will say. Imagine the following scenario, right? It's Shabbos afternoon. It's one of those long Shabbos afternoons. You've run out of stuff to do. So what do? You take a seed, you put it in the ground. 3 seconds later, you take this seed out. What's the halacha? You have violated Shabbos. You planted, right? You sowed a seed. But 1 second. I literally put it in, and then I took it right back out. Nothing happened. The Sefer HaChinuch says, Yechayiv. The malacha of Zoreya is planting a seed into the ground, again, any act which facilitates, improves the growth of a plant. The act of putting the seed and also I'll give you even a bigger example. That's an extreme example, me taking it out. I put a seed in the ground, a large wind comes and blows it right out. I'm still chayiv. Now, what the Minchas brings up is something very interesting. Is velo dummy, velo afia. The kodim shenefa kimvor b'shas tir l'josa kodim shevar. I will say, we're going to see, for example, there are other malachas. For example, baking. The halacha is if you put, let's say, dough into an oven on Shabbos, you're only chayiv for the malacha of ofa once there is some type of exterior crust, which means that technically speaking, if you were to take a dough, put it into an oven, and then pull it right out. Or both saying, or else this could come up, like if you were to take a food on Shabbos morning, and let's say put it right back on the fire, which you're not allowed to do, right? And I go ahead and I pull it right back off. If nothing happened, you haven't violated anything. So if I put the dough in the oven and I take it out before the crust forms, I have not done anything. The Minchas Chinuch says Zoreya is different. He says, Dahasam ha'afiyah hu amalacha v'chay b'shas afiyah. Aval hacha hamalachi azriya v'chayiv tekef al azriya. So the Minchas Chinuch introduces us to this idea that the malacha of Zoreya is the act of putting the seed into the ground. It's not what happens afterwards. It's actually interesting. It's not what happens afterwards. It's the act of putting the seed in the ground. And therefore, even though we all know that scientifically, when you put that seed in the ground, nothing is actually happening at that very moment. But nevertheless, that is the malacha. And therefore, even if you were to remove it, you just learned Hilchos Shabbos, it's also to go and put a seed in the ground. You quickly grab it back out, you still violated. The wind comes along and blows it out, you've still violated. A unique feature of the malacha of Zoreya. That's the position of the Minchas Chinuch. As soon as you put that seed in the ground, you're a chayiv. Look at number 7. In the Sefer Tal Oros, he quotes something fascinating. He says, now first, in the first part, he quotes this position of the Minchas Chinuch. And he says, The Melachos has Zoreya. Lo arminan de'enu chayim mishum Zoreya. Ela achi yashish ba'osa yom kolshu kedin shar Melachos. Ela de b'shashu kovea yichor o sharvit baris le'eskadel o shabuzar ziroim ba'aretz dahainu chitim nesoim kedei latzmiach miad chayim mishum Zoreya b'chol. So again, first he just quoted the position of the Minchas Chinuch, namely that the Malacha of Zoreya doesn't require anything to actually happen with the seed. Rather, the moment I go ahead and I just place it in the ground, I'm chayiv. I'm chayiv for that. Now watch this. He says, but say I'm in source number 7, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in. Mashiesh lefakte kitsasu. So the Tal Ora says, but I have a little bit of a problem with this, and I'll tell you why. Mishum dahanotea b'Shabbos yicha ba'aretz hu k'dei lehiskadel. I will say, when you put something in the ground, why are you putting it there? Why are you putting it there? To grow, right? Let's be clear on what the objective is, right? The objective is not to put a seed into the ground. The objective ultimately, again, is for something to grow. He says, "V'chein habozer chitim ba'aretz hu k'dei latzmiach." Well, if you ever see the way they plant wheat, so when you take seed and you scatter it around, that's the bozer, right? You scatter it around. So what's the idea of scattering the seeds? The idea over here is I want something to grow. Imkein ikar hamalacha she'asra Torah. So this is what it says. So Tal Ora says, it doesn't make sense to say that the malacha is the placement of the seed in the ground. That's not my goal. My goal is for something to grow. That's my goal. And therefore the malacha of Zoreya is, as we said before, Abba, say any act which causes, facilitates, or improves growth. Right, the Tal Ora says the Melachos Zoreya is not putting a seed in the ground. Putting a seed in the ground is inconsequential if nothing happens with it. The goal is putting the seed in the ground so it could grow. He says, "V'cheva, listen to this. De'ikar ma'aseu dahainu atzmicha v'agidol eno ma'ala umor the Shabbos." Now, boss, here's the problem. Here's the problem. If you hold that the ikar malacha of Zoreya is not the placement of the seed in the ground, rather, what is it? What is it? It's something growing. So, boss, you run into a technical issue, which is what? How can you ever violate Zoreya on Shabbos? Why? Nothing's ever going to grow on Shabbos. In other words, anything you put on the ground in Shabbos is not growing on Shabbos. So if that's the case, how are you ever violating? So you hear what's happening over here? So according to the Sefer Minchas Chinuch, makes a lot of sense. The malacha of Zoreya is putting a seed in the ground. That's it. You put a seed in the ground. That's the malacha. Tal Ora says that's not the malacha. The malacha ultimately, again, is causing or facilitating growth. Well, no growth is happening on Shabbos. How are you in violation of this malacha? So listen to this. Rather, when does the growth take place? Ela lechol bizman haheter. Growth takes place. When does growth take place? Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, during the week. Nimtza she'in ze zoreya onotea b'Shabbos ala b'chol. So it turns out that my act of planting a seed in the ground on Shabbos doesn't really do anything on Shabbos, but rather it literally lays the groundwork ultimately for growth after Shabbos. V'lama yichuyev b'Shabbos mishum Zoreya me'achar sheguf ha'isr dahinu atzmicha v'agidul lo na'aseh bo bayom. So again, why would I ever be chayav for Zoreya on Shabbos if at the end of the day none of the growth is happening on Shabbos itself? It's a good kasha. Shabbos says, so skip down a little bit. Skip down. You see 1, 2, 3, 4 lines up from the bottom. Middle of the line, hu adin. Hey. You see that? So listen to this. Shabbos says, hu adin nami, misha zoreya notea b'Shabbos chitim, kevan da'oso zoreya shazara b'Shabbos gorim lahatzmiach. So listen to this. So therefore, again, writes the Tal Oros. So rather, here's the way the malacha works. That which you put on Shabbos, that which you plant on Shabbos, ultimately results in growth later on. Af she'en matzmiach bo bayom, mikol makom haschalos hazriya chashirina lama'osa shah shazara b'Shabbos, ulahachi hazareya b'Shabbos chayiv, haklala olim masha kasavti l'zreya b'Shabbos af shelo yishush bo bayom chemish zera. Both listen to this. Essentially what Tal Oro says, in the part that I skipped. He says essentially, we'll say, that halacha l'maisa, it's almost like retroactivity. That what ends up happening is, when that seed takes root on Tuesday, it turns out that when did the Maisa Zriya really begin? When did the act of sowing really begin? Shabbos. So I will say, so it turns out something amazing. According to Tal Oros, if you plant the seed on Shabbos, technically speaking, you're not actually chayav for Chil Shabbos until when? We'll call it Tuesday, 72 hours later. Then once the seed begins to germinate, it turns out that when did this act of germination, when did this act of sowing really begin? It began on Shabbos. So both say, yeah.
So does that
Well, actually, just give me so both say, now listen to this. Now I'm taking your question. I'm sorry. So now you see this fundamental machlokes over here between the Minchas Chinuch and the Tal Oros. The Minchas Chinuch telling us that halacha lemaisa, one violates the malacha of Zoreya as soon as you place the seed into the ground, because he holds that the malacha is not the growth. The malacha is the placement of the seed. The Tal Oros says, no, that's not true. The malacha is the growth. And therefore, halacha lemaisa, you're only chayiv when? When the seed begins to germinate. But the seed begins to germinate on Tuesday. I'm just using Tuesday as an example. That is true, but once it does begin to germinate on Tuesday, then lemafreya, retroactively, it turns out that you are chayiv on Shabbos. Now, both say, now what I'll just mention to this is, there's an interesting nafkamina. Right? What'll be the nafkamina over here? What'll be the nafkamina over here?
if the wind blew it out?
If the wind blew it out, or even better. Matzeh Shabbos, I come and I remove the seed from the ground. Right? Again, you can't really do it on Shabbos, because let's say on Shabbos you might run into a muktzah issue, but Matzeh Shabbos, I decide I want to become a Baal Tshuva. I go back to the field, I remove the seed. According to the Minchas, let's go through this. According to the Minchas Chinuch, what's the halacha? Chayiv. According to Tal Oros, you are pater. So whether the wind blows it out, or whether you go ahead and actively remove it yourself, halacha lemaisa, you would be pater from the malacha of Zoreya. Yeah.
Would the Talmud say that if you planted it on Thursday and now it's going to germinate on Shabbos, you know it's going to germinate on Shabbos, but that's the right amount of time?
No, because then you can never plant anything. Right? Again, on Shabbos, remember, we don't have a problem with malacha occurring on Shabbos. The same reason that you could go ahead and have your food cooking on Shabbos also, right? Your food doesn't have to be fully cooked before Shabbos starts. But there's a Maisa Bishul. The Ikar on Shabbos is you can't do malacha. We don't have a problem having malacha done on your behalf.
So even if you do nothing and it just happens not to grow, you'd be plucked and also according to
Oh yeah, it could be according to Tal Oros that the seed just didn't take. Right? This is the whole chap. Actually, it's interesting when people plant wheat. So that's what they do. They scatter the seeds, recognizing that there are going to be seeds that do not take root. So it could very well be. I don't know how you would look at this, but it could very well be that according to Minchas Chinuch, you're the chayiv regardless for I don't know if there's individual liability for each seed, or that's just called one maisa of seeding. But in Achinam, according to Tal Oros, any seeds that do not take root, you would not be chayiv for. Correct.
No, you answered.
Good. Excellent. All right, good. So we'll say, so this is a fascinating machlokes, and you're going to see actually, interestingly enough, it's not just, again, obviously it's a profound machlokes because it's a definitional machlokes in the malacha. Like, what is the malacha itself, gufa? And we're going to see other ramifications. Yes, okay.
How can you ever have Hasra according to the Tal Oros, if you don't know for sure that the mice is going to take place? Because it's not putting it into the ground that's the problem.
Why? You're not allowed to do this lest it comes to take roots. If it takes root, you're chayiv. Why? Because you're saying it's not a definitive hasra?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a good kasha. I don't know. Maybe it's definitive enough. In other words, it could be that also conditional hasra is only problematic if it's totally biyadcha. You may or may not do this. But lamaisa, if your act is defined, but it's up to, an act of God or act of nature, maybe that is called definitive hasra. But I don't know. I didn't see him discuss the hasra piece. It's a good kasha. So both say. So what I would tell you about this is, interestingly enough, this is actually brought down in the poskim. Which is actually quite interesting. Which is, so what happens lamaisa if someone does put a seed? I will say, by the way, I just want to point out to you, just so you understand, like we all think, like, okay, this malach has nothing to do with me putting a seed in the ground. It has everything to do with us. I'll give you an example. You're going ahead and you're eating a plum outside, right? And now you finish the plum. So what do you want to do? Again, you just want to throw the pit. You can't do that on Shabbos. You cannot discard a pit onto soil on Shabbos. That is the malacha of Zoreya. You have an apple core, right? We're going to see, by the way, you have grapes. You're eating watermelon, and you just want to spit out the seeds. Spitting out the seeds could be even a bit more problematic because there's saliva involved in that as well, and that might be other malachas involved as well. But the idea of just taking pits and just putting them down on the ground is halachically problematic. What I will point out is something very interesting. So I will say, so this machlokes, the min chasinuch and the tal oros, is there, right? It's kind of hanging out there. So it is interesting that some of the contemporary posts can bring down, and they say that essentially we hold a suffix da'araisa l'chumra. So because we say suffix da'araisa l'chumra, how would we paskin? How would you paskin? Min chasinuch. Because that obviously is the more stringent position. So therefore, like lemaisa, the way we paskin is, if you put a seed in the ground on Shabbos, you are chayiv for violating a malacha da'araisa. Okay. That being said, the poskim say, however, that on Matzah Shabbos, go back and take out the seed. Go back and take out the seed, because like this, at least according to one opinion, and by the Talmud, it's not just one opinion; it's a school of thought. Right? According to that opinion, at least you've obviated the malacha. So again, it's almost like halacha l'maisa, and it's kind of machlokes. We'll have to go with the more chumradik opinion, which is a minchas chinuch. But cover your bases. Matzah Shabbos, remove the seed from the ground. So we'll talk about this a little bit. We'll talk about this. The problem you're going to get into is bepashtus. The seed, once it hits the ground, is going to be muktzah. The earth itself, if the seed is in the earth, is muktzah. Maybe as a graf shall re'ip. So we'll talk about it. We'll see if there are ways that you could immediately remedy it. We'll talk. Take a look at number 8. So in the Sefer Shvis HaShabbos, here it is. Tavlachosh l'svara harishona. What he calls a svara rishona, but for us, he's referring to the tal oros. He says, "Vim hishlich zraim begina am komos lachim yira lelaktem kodem sheyitzmechu." So he quotes it over here. Even though really we're going to see the meikar adin, we pass like the minchas chinuch, and therefore once you plant that seed, you have transgressed the malacha d'oraisa. But nevertheless, after Shabbos, go pick up the seed if you can. Okay, let's begin to look at the Shulchan Aruch. We'll say, here we go, and you're going to see there are some really interesting ramifications of this. Number 9. Yesh li zor melahashlich zroim b'makom yiridas geshamim. We'll say on Shabbos, you have to be careful about throwing seeds on the ground. Throwing seeds on the ground in a place. B'makom yiridas geshamim means in a watered place. I will say we're going to see, by the way, one of the common denominators between. There's going to be a lot of common themes between Choresh and Zoreya. One of the interesting common pieces is just like Choresh only applies where? What type of earth? What type of earth? Earth that is capable of sustaining growth, right? In other words, if you go out and you make a hole, remember in your sandbox, right? There's no malacha in that. If you make a hole in the desert, there's no malacha in that. Zoreya is the same thing, right? That's why the Shulchan Aruch says over here on Shabbos, be careful about throwing seeds around in a place that is watered, right? That is capable of sustaining growth. Shesofan latzmiach. Now look what I will say. So this is actually really interesting. He says, "Im yashlich l'tarnagolim." So I have to feed my chickens. What do you feed your chickens? Seed. Right? You feed them seed. I will say, so now here's my problem. So now my chickens are pecking around, right? And now again, the area where they are is technically speaking soil that could support growth. And now I'm throwing seed on the ground for them. So isn't that problematic? Isn't that problematic on Shabbos? So that's something very interesting. He says, if you're going to throw seed to your chickens, lo yashlich ela keshir shiyochlu bo bayom o liyomayim. Make sure to only put out enough seed, the amount that they would consume for a day or 2. Now, why does he say a day or 2 and not 3? Germination, right? So just make sure that it's only enough seed that at most is going to last 1 or 2 days. However, again, if the chickens are eating in a place where people walk around, mutter, there's no problem. Why? Shein sofel itzmach. As well as since people are walking around there, pedestrian traffic is going to destroy any possibility of potential growth. So also, let's take a look at this. Take a look at number 10, Mishnah Berurah. So the Mishnah Berurah, skip to the second Mishnah Berurah, Lamed Beis, Shesof al Atzmiach. He says, Perish, sheyitzmechu machmas harichuch kederach kol tvua, kishenosnim osa b'mayim, u'til kama osim yud aleph, o efshar de bizman meruba yishashu b'karka. So again, this is really like, again, it might not be so lamaisa for us if we're not chicken farmers, right? But lamaisa, again, you have to feed your chickens on Shabbos. You're feeding them seed. You're throwing it on ground, on earth that technically speaking could grow stuff. So again, you have to be careful, says Mishnah Berurah. Only put out enough that the chickens could consume within a day or 2. Now look at Lamed Gimel, Ol Yomayim, Tebizman Zmuat Kazeh Lo Yitzmechu. Because I will say, since the chickens are going to consume it within a day or 2, nothing's going to take root. Now watch this. V'chol shekain de lo yishreshu bekarka, ma she'enkim legimel yamim v'yoser yitzmechu azroim. What's going to happen? We'll say, if you put out enough seed, that the seed could even be there for 3 days, this gets much more problematic, right? Because what are we concerned about now? That ultimately, again, the seeds are going to take root. V'yischayev lemafreya mishum zoreya. And I will say, if the seeds end up taking root after 3 days, what happens? You're actually actively chayev for zoreya. I will say, who does that sound like? Talaro. So we'll say, it is interesting that as much as midda araisa, we're going to paskin like the minchas chinuch, namely that the malacha of Zoreya occurs as soon as you put a seed into the ground. We see the tal oros keeps coming up time and time again. We're concerned if you put too much seed out for the chickens and it ends up staying there for more than 3 days or for 3 days or more, it's going to end up taking root and halacha l'maisor you're actively going to be chayiv. He says, Gam l'chadevi ardeya kol shir hashasha enu ela gimel yomim v'da. So we'll say, by the way, this is also, we're going to talk about this more. Halacha just operates with this idea that the germination window is 3 days. V'da demari dehishach hasazram b'pam achos dem lav hachi asra lahachin limei hachol. So we'll say, so this is just interesting. Okay, it's good to know if you have chickens, which l'maisa we'll say is also the assumption over here is you're throwing all the seed at once. If you're throwing this seed at different times, you may be running into 2 problems. Number 1 problem is Zoreya. Number 2 problem is hachana, preparing. Because technically speaking, if your first act of throwing, you threw enough seed for Shabbos, and now you throw again, and there's more, then you're actively preparing on Shabbos for the next day for Sunday. If it's all kind of in one fell swoop, even if it's more seed than you need for Shabbos, you may run into a problem of Zoreya, but you won't run into a problem of achana. So we'll stop over here for tonight. Shkoyach is starting this new malacha. B'nai Hashem, next week, we're back to regular schedule. Monday night to B'nai Hashem. We're going to continue. I would just tell you like this. I'm going to have to see how in depth we're going to get into this, because actually one of the very interesting sugyas in Lumdus that comes up by the malacha of Zoreya is actually the sugya of atzitz nakov and atzitz she'eno nakov. Perforated flower pots, non-perforated flower pots. Again, it gets into some interesting contemporary shots with hydroponics, right? Do hydroponics have malacha of Zoreya? I don't know. I'm gonna see how in depth we're gonna get there, because I'm trying to keep this a bit more lemaisa, and we'd certainly like to move a little bit at a faster pace for some of our earlier malachas. But all right, Hashem, stay tuned for next week. I will say shkoyach.
Rabbi, could you say that Zoreya is